Hi there, and welcome back to 19th Century Art. Now we begin the second section of this course, and we're going to return in time to an earlier period in British and European history to look at the popular arts and how they come to influence the life of the 19th century. To begin with, we're going to look at an Italian invention known as caricatura, or what we now broadly call caricature. This was an invention that surprisingly emerged in the Renaissance among the Italians as a way to break up the tedium of drawing from life. Artists were trained to make exaggerations, to bring expression into their figure drawings. These caricatures, the word caricature meaning to load or burden or exaggerate, distort the facial and bodily features in order to achieve some kind of unique result that typifies the person being caricatured. The distortions are fascinating because it's not just that you got it wrong, but that somehow by distorting the figure, you are bringing about a closer examination of who the person truly is. And so caricature became a private fashion among artists and their patrons. Here is Agostino Carracci and Annibale Carracci, who are two of the early practitioners of this new technique. But many famous artists employed this and encouraged their friends to do so as well. But for the most part, these were private matters, and people did not publish caricatures of famous people. That would be considered a breach of trust. In Britain, the artist by the name of William Hogarth took the idea of caricature in a different direction. While he was widely regarded as a caricaturist during his own lifetime, he really loathed the identification with this simple art, and he always strove to bring beauty and excellence and exceptional craftsmanship to his work. William Hogarth, shown here with his homely pet dog, is a very curious man. He really took great pride in British culture, and he loathed the artists who imitated continental fashions and tastes, and he strove to create a uniquely British idea about art. One of his early works that brought about a transformation in his style was a collection of engravings that he made that illustrated a story called Hudibras Sallies Forth. In this story, this is a sort of Protestant version of Don Quixote, and in it he began to really examine how to tell a story that would excite and interest viewers, to really zoom in on a critical moment that really told you a great deal about these people and their relationships. So in this situation here, we have Hudibras, who is going through this town. This man is backing up to bow to pay this gentleman respect, and he inadvertently knocks over this woman's market stall. So in Hogarth's engravings, we see really tremendous attention to the detail of lived experience. Now, Hogarth's great fame would be when he took this idea of pictures that told stories, and he began to imagine telling his own story in such a way that just by looking at the picture, you would find all the information you needed to understand what was going on. And he realized this idea in his first major artistic creation, The Harlot's Progress. Now, the word progress here means to make a journey, an allegorical story about a harlot, a young girl from the countryside who becomes a prostitute in the city. And it shows about her downfall. What are the factors at stake? And so in this first picture, we see Moll, who's come from the countryside. We see this whole wagon of girls there arriving from the countryside. and she's been dropped off, and we can see from the packages and the notes that she was there to meet her sister, who has now been delayed. And instead, she is greeted by our madam. And in the doorway, we see men lustfully looking on this young new girl who's come to join the brothel. Right above our madam is a bell. Again, the idea of this sort of sexual image of the hammer inside the bell, and also this idea of the swinging motion of the bell, this vacillating morality that's happening here. And the idea of the fall, that behind Maul is a pastor who should be interceding, should be looking out for these young girls, but instead seems to be preoccupied by a letter of introduction to some wealthy patron in the city. His horse is eating the hay and is toppled over a bucket. And just like the apples in the previous picture, Hogarth likes to capture a briefest moment, as if we're seeing this happen right before our eyes. The bucket is about to fall. And so there are lots of images in here and clues that tell us about the story, and it's a complicated story. Now, initially, he put no words to his pictures. He wanted people to study them, to learn by the visual information they could find on their own. And this proved very exciting. People were enormously fascinated by these complex pictures. These were fairly large engravings, and they were allowed people to kind of pore over them. He would put them on display in a public hall and charge admission, and if you were wealthy enough, you could buy a complete set of his engravings. This proved to be enormously popular, and there were plays based on these stories that he had created. Now, if we look at these stories, what Hogarth has done is something rather ingenious. It's a series of stories that happen over time, and there had been, up until this point, many visual stories that did just this, telling the life of a character through a series of stories. But in this case, in Harlot's Progress, Hogarth has done one thing more. He has made it a consequential narrative, that what happens in one picture directly reflects the actions of the previous picture, that these actions are cumulative, and we see a cause and effect between them, that we are engaged in a story where one thing leads to another, and all of this leads us to an understanding about what's happening to this young woman as she takes on patrons and becomes a celebrated harlot, and then as she has her downfall, she is sent into prison. And this is a way in which Hogarth is leading us through the story, telling us about things that are key moments in her downfall. Now, the amount of time that occurs between these pictures is ambiguous. Is it a matter of months? Is it a matter of years? That is inconsequential. What is significant is that because of how she is behaving and acting in this picture, that directly leads to our understanding of what's going on in the next picture and the next. And so the story is told entirely visual. And this was a very novel and unique invention. The significance of this is that it allows the consequential narrative to tell an original story, a story that is not illustrating a tale written down or told orally, but is a story that exists only in pictures. He, in a sense, took history painting, and instead of trying to show it all at once in what is called a monoscenic narrative, he breaks it up into a series of scenes to allow us to look even closer at what the consequences of people's actions are. Now, Hogarth's work was enormously popular and influential at this time. There were lots of people who imitated his very story and printed it much cheaper. And what he needed to do was to actually get some kind of copyright protection. The statue of Anne had been created some 20 years earlier, and it protected only the words on the page, not the pictures on the page. And so you could copy other people's art, but you could not copy their words. Hogarth argued persuasively that if engraving is ever going to become a viable business in Britain, copyright law must be extended to include graven images as well. And he refused to produce any more work until the Parliament agreed to pass what became known as Hogarth's Act of 1735. And as soon as that was passed, he put out another extremely popular series of stories, this time following the downfall of a rake, a man who is inherited a bunch of money and loses it all through women and wine and gambling. And so this is the final scene of Rake's Progress. We see him in a madhouse, and there the ladies in the background are laughing and pointing at all the people there who are housed in this asylum. He has now become the object of their ridicule. And so this, again, made Hogarth a great deal of money, and he could now persecute people who attempted to steal his images and profit from his inventions. He explored on many occasions this idea of the consequential narrative. In this two-picture series, he very beautifully illustrates the consequences of one action with another. Here we see a woman fighting off a man's advances and the excitement and tumult of the room. And in the next picture, we see her pleading with him pulling up his trousers, looking like he's done his job, and she begging him to marry her now that he's had his way with her. And the dog that was once yapping is now fast asleep. And the mirror is overturned and broken. And there's a lot of symbolism here. I could talk about the pictures on the wall and the fallen curtain that comes directly down toward her. This is what made Hogarth such a really fascinating artist, was his attention to the composition that could tell a story in an entirely visual manner. His next longer series, we actually have the paintings. Now, one of the ways in which he did his work was that Hogarth made these slightly larger paintings, and then he would transfer his composition that he worked up in color in a painting into an engraving. And so many of his earlier series were destroyed in a fire, but here we have one of his surviving paintings. He had always hoped that he would be recognized as a fine artist and that his paintings would fetch a nice price. But in many cases, he couldn't find a buyer. People loved his engravings. They thought he was a rich comic, a caricaturist of popular stories of the now. But no one ever took him terribly seriously, which caused him great consternation. Here in the story, called Marriage a la Mode, we have the first scene shortly after the marriage of these two young people. They both have been out partying all night, and their accountant is throwing up his hands, walking out with a huge pile of bills. He doesn't know what to do with these two young kids who have no responsibility for their money. Now, if we look at comparatively, we can see that the painting is about 27.5 inches tall by about 36 inches long. And this design allowed him to create a rich study for his engraving, which was fairly large at 17 inches long and 13.5 inches tall. So notice how the engraving is flipped. He transferred the image directly onto the plate such that when the plate was printed, it would emerge reversed. Now, what's interesting to me about the painting is that the composition in the painting is not as strong as the composition in the engraving. The way in which the accountant is leaving off to the right follows the action and our movement from left to right in a much more strong and convincing way. By having him exit to the left feels somehow unresolved. I look at this and I think perhaps he intended always the engraving to be this important way people saw the composition, that in his mind he was already reversing it. So if we look at Hogarth's work compared to a true history painting from the time we'd seen Benjamin West's The Death of General Wolfe from 1770, remember how General Wolfe, how idealized it was, how the characters were posed in these classical manner, and that it was composed to tell of a heroic event in a larger-than-life way. And by comparison, Hogarth's is very secular. It concerns the real lives of real people as they're going about their rather destitute and poorly managed lives. And Hogarth intentionally wanted to show people in these worse situations the way in which their own actions brought down their own downfall. And for him, this was a very important moral lesson about life as it is being lived today. And while many people would look at this and say that Hogarth's work is a caricature of the present day, he very seriously tried to make a very beautiful and convincing and realistic portrait of what he saw. Now, interestingly, Hogarth, unlike most artists at this time, did not draw from models. He did not have a model come in and stand and pose for him while he painted. Instead, he went about and looked from life, and he made these really brief sketches while he was watching people move. And then he would go back to his studio and sort of translate these brief sketches that captured the essential elements of someone's gesture. So he was really trying to communicate the way people moved and acted in their daily lives. Now, that said, it's been pointed out that Hogarth relied a great deal on theater and ballet for his poses and ideas. But even still, he really does communicate very effectively what's going on in the lives of people today. And for that reason, he was deemed a lesser artist. He tried to burnish his credentials as a fine artist by publishing a text on the analysis of beauty. In it, he looks very closely at the art of antiquity, and he makes his own claim to fame as an artist who is the one who truly understands and emulates the ideas of beauty set down from the classical past. He is very disparaging about caricature, and he shows in this line of images from 105 to 97 how the caricature is this gross simplification that belies the true beauty of the natural world. And he shows how he used this curved line is an example of how you capture beauty. This is this classical curved line. He called the line of beauty. You'll notice if you go back and look at that portrait, that self-portrait he made, I showed you early on. Here on his painting palette, this line of beauty has been etched with the words, the line of beauty. He clearly intended this to be his legacy. Unfortunately, people thought he was just being pretentious and obtuse. He used his fame in many ways and his wealth to do many important things for the community. He opened a hospital for women and children and a home for orphans. But he also got involved in other political dealings, and his reputation was tarnished for them. This is the last printed image we know from Hogarth. It is called The Bathos from 1764. In it, everything is in ruins. His palette is cracked. Everything about him is broken and scattered. And we see this crumpled figure of the angel of death expiring with the words finis. I want to call your attention to one of the most extraordinary details in this engraving, and that is on the far right, right in the middle of the picture, there's a hole in the sky, and through that hole is peering Hogarth, looking on to the wreckage that is his life. Now, the fashion of the day was very heavily influenced by French tastes. This was one of the problems that Hogarth had. He was always a staunch advocate of British tastes and British arts. And the fashion at the time was everyone wanted to dress up in this new macaroni style, this giant hairdo that was piled up like a plate of spaghetti from Italy. And this was the sort of extravagant look that people in the city were trying to outdo from each other. Here is a really interesting caricature. That is, what is this, my son Tom? The country squire has his son who's returned from the city wearing this outlandish outfit, and he's pointing to this crazy hairdo, and he's saying, what is this, my son Tom? What have you got yourself into? What will you become next year when the fashions change? Whereas the country squire is dressed in the clothing of a typical country squire, something that probably hasn't changed for hundreds of years. He is pointing out the absurd and the outrageousness of today's fashions, the way men, especially, and women were going about in these enormous clothing styles, a crazy, brightly colored and extravagant dress. And what's interesting about this, the macaroni style prompted a growth in interest in caricature, that to wear fancy clothing and to call one's attention to oneself was a sort of way that you could become a celebrity, that you could shine and be known as an individual. Even if you were following the fashions, everyone's fashion was slightly different, although all sort of exaggerated in similar ways. So the macaroni style was the beginning of this transition toward a period when caricature becomes fashionable, when people, instead of being embarrassed or humiliated by being caricatured in a drawing, it was actually a sign that you'd become famous. Caricature in politics was becoming enormously influential. James Gilray was one of the leading caricaturists of the day, and he is famous today even still because his drawings are just so outrageous, so fantastic and extravagant, everything done to this extraordinary degree. Here he shows the politician William Pitt charging on a horse naked and leading the battle, and all his political enemies are falling by the wayside in this apocalyptic vision and the prestiges of the millennium, meaning this is a sign of things to come. James Gilroy was such a popular caricaturist that William Pitt actually paid him to make flattering pictures of him, if we're willing to consider this a flattering picture. And so James Gilroy did this to promote the cause of William Pitt. Here's a really interesting picture by James Gilroy. It is a parody of the fears that people had with the inoculation against the cowpox and the wonderful effects of the new inoculation, it says sarcastically. So as people are having this cowpox administered to them by the doctor, cows are popping out of their lesions and various orifices of their bodies in a kind of extravagant and ridiculous way. James Gilroy suffered terrible gout, and here in one of his most powerful caricatures, he illustrates the incredible pain that he was in with his gout that's tearing at his flesh. His claws has dug deep into his foot, and it is personification of this flaming demon that has attacked him. And we can see it's done from the perspective of him sort of looking at his own foot, swollen and disfigured by the gout. Another popular caricaturist of this time was Thomas Rowlandson. He did not go in so much for caricaturing actual politicians. Instead, he took on whole classes of people. Barristers. This is a better strategy because you're less likely to be sued for libel by printing an unflattering caricature. Thomas Rowlandson created a sequence of stories with a caricature of the country Latin professor, Dr. Syntax. And he goes on a sabbatical of sorts in search of the picturesque. And he created a series of pictures telling the story. Now, the story is a little less consequential in its telling than we have with Hogarth, but it is in many ways a popular character being used to tell an original story. Dr. Syntax was such a popular character, in fact, that Thomas Rowlandson came out with 2 more adventures of Dr. Syntax. Here you can see him sketching the lake, and he's trying to draw the lake while sitting on the horse, which is sort of akin to trying to take a photograph of a landscape while you're whizzing by in a car. Late in the story, the doctor has this fevered dream where he's asleep in a library, and he imagines all the books in the library flitting about him, enticing him to create his own book. So Rowlandson's creation, Dr. Syntax, was so popular, as I said, he created several stories with this one character. And as a character, people began to use him to market and sell goods. So you could actually buy commercial merchandise that was branded Dr. Syntax powdered wig or some such business. And so this is interesting development. This is the first time a cartoon character is being used to market and brand merchandise. Fashions of the day were changing by the beginning of the 19th century, and the man who was chiefly responsible for the transformation in men's fashion was Beau Brummel, in a change in dress that was so dramatic and so influential that historians of fashion refer to this time as the Great Male Renunciation. What does that mean? Well, it means that they were finally rejecting the female-styled fashions of France from 1775, and now this new cavalry uniform look that was cultivated by Beau Brummel into the dandy. And it was just as particular and just as detail-oriented, but it was subdued and conservative. It showed this kind of sharp, clean, crisp lines. Ornamentation was kept to a minimum, and yet it was also something that people had to aspire to. A clean white dress, absolutely impeccable. So all the character of this clothing required an enormous amount of work to maintain, but it was also slightly subdued and understated in a way that men's fashions had never been before. Beau Brummel was famous for being famous, and for that reason he's often referred to as the first influencer. He took 5 hours to dress, and people paid admission to watch him prepare his clothing, and he would polish his boots with champagne. George Cruikshank was the third great caricaturist of Britain of this time. He began, like the others, finding ways to exaggerate the fears and terrors of the day. Here he shows a French guillotine come to life as a monster, haunting all the nobility and the priests of the clergy as a radical reformer comes to kill them all. Because the fear of the French Revolution, as we mentioned earlier, with the destruction of the Luddite campaign, was a very powerful force in British society. There was a concerted effort to try and suppress any kind of revolutionary behavior. Cruikshank followed the trajectory of the more restrained and subdued tastes of this what's known as the Regency period, and he began to create a series of moral illustrated stories, the first of which was called The Bottle, which was an abstinence campaign propaganda showing about the terrible influence of alcohol on the lower classes. Here, a mother has received bread and alcohol, and the father is looking, his shadow on the wall, dejected and drunk, while all the family suffers. The cat is looking extremely scrawny. Unlike Hogarth, Cruikshank felt it necessary to write words for his story, and he illustrated this and published them in a collection of prints that proved highly popular. He followed up the story of The Bottle with the downfall of the children of the drunkard. They too take up drinking and find themselves in a desperate strait. Finally, at the very end of The Drunkard's Children, we see the daughter throwing herself off in the bridge. This extremely desperate image of a woman brought to complete despair by the alcohol that has consumed her family. I want to finish by talking about a very influential man in Britain at the beginning of the 19th century. Sir John Soane was a wealthy architect, famous for designing many important buildings in London, including the Bank of England, and his work was extremely influential on many parts of government and commercial architecture of the day. He collected antiquities on his grand tour in 1778 and continued to amass a vast collection and library and architectural elements and even an Egyptian sarcophagus, all brought into his house in London. He eventually purchased the two other adjoining houses on this street in Lincoln's Inn Field, and you can go and visit this today. Due to an 1833 Act of Parliament, his home was designated a museum. Now, what makes Sir John Soane so remarkable is not only did he provide for excellent examples of classical art that people found inspiring in the times, he also celebrated William Hogarth. He had bought a number of Hogarth's paintings and he featured them prominently in his collection. He believed Hogarth to be a true British original genius, worthy of our emulation. So here we are, nearly 100 years after the death of William Hogarth. He is finally recognized for his tremendous contributions toward art. And is one of the more important legacies that we have is his influence on the development of picture stories.